The word cinematic doesn't actually mean anything. What's up guys, Neverlandy here and welcome back to a new video. If you're new to this channel, there's one thing you need to know. I make videos with and about the Canon 90D, the Canon M50, the Canon EOS R and the Canon R6. This one, filming right now. So what do I talk about today? Well, I keep getting comments with a question. For example, I got one yesterday. What are your C-Log 3 settings? I always struggle with this. That's very easy. If you watch all of my videos, you should already know the best settings to shoot with the Canon R6 and C-Log 3. So I just decided to make this video to define like the best way to shoot when we use C-Log, and usually the purpose is for the footage to look cinematic, right? Right. But what's cinematic? What does it mean? It means that our eyes will perceive the video as cinematic, like what we see at the movies. And how is that? There's a bunch of options that are applied more often than not for movies, like big movies like Hollywood and many others also. So let's dive into the settings. I want to be fast. I want to be quick. First thing we need to do if we want to shoot something cinematic is to choose the right frame rate. And what is it? Usually it's 24 frames per second, actually 23 point something. And why is that? It's actually a standard for the movie industry almost since the very beginning, because of course movies were shot on film. Film was expensive, so they needed to optimize everything, and 24 frames per second is the minimum amount of frames in a second that when we played as a video one after the other, our eyes will perceive the single frames played together as a movement. Why is that cinematic? Just because they decided to use the minimum frame rate to get the best results, spending less money. So that's it. Okay, shoot 24 frames per second or 23 point something and you're good to go. Cinematic, right? No. There is more than that. Like the shutter speed, you should adjust it to get the most natural blur in the movement in the shot. We need to set the shutter speed double the frame rate. In this case, 24 frames per second, more or less, 48, 1/48th of a second. But we don't have it here on the Canon R6. I think we don't have it in Canon cameras. So we set it to 1/50th of a second, but we're not obliged to. It depends on the shot and depends on the feeling we want to convey in the shot, in our movie or in our particular scene. For a regular shot, just double the frame rate, 1/50th of a second. If you want to be creative, do something different, something particular for a scene or something, either higher or lower. You decide. The word cinematic doesn't actually mean anything. When we think of cinematic, we think of the movies, Hollywood, so a high dynamic range. So we have to do what we can, we have to make things do with our cameras. And the best way to get the best possible dynamic range on the Canon R6 is to shoot in log, like C-Log. In this case, we have C-Log 3. So you open the menu, go to log settings, C-Log 3, and then we have quite a few options. So also here it depends, because we have color spaces. For example, we have BT 709, BT 2020 and Cinema Gamut. We have these three options. So which one should we choose? Well, I made a video about it showing samples and where I talk about it, and honestly I don't think one is better than the other. So my advice, just play around with them, shoot something with each of these color spaces and then choose the one that you feel more comfortable with when you color grade it. Now that we have our frame rate, our shutter speed, and we're ready to shoot using C-Log 3, there's one more thing we need to do. Actually a bunch of things, but let's say one which is really important. Set the ISO to 800. When we shoot with a default picture style, we need to set it to ISO 100. When we use C-Log, it has to be 400. When we use C-Log 3, it has to be 800. So if we shoot at night having a native ISO, a basic ISO of 800, it's a plus. I mean, it's not a negative thing at all. And if you think the footage is gonna be grainy, no, don't even think about it, because I shot even ISO 6400 and with the Canon R6, and it was perfect. However, it might be a problem during the day in sunlight, especially if you want to shoot with a fast lens and a wide aperture like f1.2, f1.8 or even wider. My advice, get an ND filter. What's an ND filter? It's like sunglasses for your lens. I made a video about it where I show that sometimes when we shoot outside in the sun, it's almost impossible to get some decent exposure unless we use an ND filter. Better if a variable ND filter. Now, aperture f1.8, and look at it. There's not a way to reduce the amount of light passing through the lens hit the sensor, because if you try through the shutter speed, it's not gonna work. It's gonna change the blur and the movement. It's gonna look all jittery. And if we lower the ISO, the quality might be affected, because we're supposed to use at least ISO 800. Only solution, ND filter. Another thing to mention about the cinematic settings for the Canon R6 and C-Log 3, everybody thinks that background blur, the shallow depth of field, is a synonym of cinematic. Well, actually not. Everything has to be functional. Everything needs to be done for a specific reason. So when you switch from one subject to the other, like focus pulling, yeah, it looks cool, but it has to make sense in the shot. So of course, when you use a lens with a wider aperture, you can get a very blurry background. Just think how often you need it in your film, in your movie, in your video. You don't need it all the time. So don't abuse it. Look who's talking. and also another thing that's considered synonym of cinematic, it's slow motion. Just ask yourself, how often do you see a slow motion sequence in a movie? Shallow depth of field, slow motion, yeah, they are means, they are one way of making one specific scene or something, but we should not abuse these kind of shots. And I'm telling this also to myself, because you know how much I love slow motion and shallow depth of field, but everything has to be functional, has to make sense in the overall, in the scene, in the sequence, in the movie, film, video, whatever we're shooting. So now the settings on your camera are good, you got your shot, then don't forget to color grade it. And you can use either DaVinci Resolve, which is the one I use, or Premiere Pro or Final Cut. These are the best three, I think. I mean, the best three softwares to edit your videos, as far as I know. There's also iMovie, but I wouldn't use that. I mean, unless what you're doing is really amateur, I would not use it. Or maybe just for really basic stuff. Okay, so I guess that's it for today, and I really hope you enjoyed this one. And when will I see you? Guess what? I'll see you in the next video.